Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on the patient's voice impact on the drug development lifecycle. I'm Abby Bronson, the SVP of Research Strategy from PPMD. I have a colleague with me, Ryan Fisher, who is the SVP of Community Engagement at PPMD. And before we get started, I would like to thank MDA and Amicus Therapeutics for giving us this opportunity today to tell you a little bit about the patient's voice and all the different ways that it can impact the drug development life cycle and some of what PPMD has been doing. So we're going to talk about the role of the patient voice in the drug development life cycle today and show you how there's different ways it can be collected and evaluated, how it can be used in understanding the benefit risk assessments that often times go into drug development, and then even look further on how the patient voice can actually influence the design of a trial itself. So just for those of you who might need a little bit of background who are not familiar with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, it's an X-linked pediatric neuromuscular disease, muscle disease. It's there at birth. The onset, we start to see symptoms in early childhood. We think there's about, the incidence rate is about 1 in 5,000 boys. They get diagnosed anywhere between 3 and 5 years of age. Mean age of death is 28, although with improved standard of care, we are pushing that out a little bit, but most individuals with Duchenne die around 30 years old. The disease is predictable in that there is a progressive loss of function by milestones, and yet there's a lot of variability in the rate of progression. We have a very active drug development space with over 40 companies working on developing drugs. We've had in recent years 2 approvals, actually 3 now, I'll have to say, because Sarepta had their second exon skipping therapy approved, but five drug programs that did not make it, which is really disappointing for us. The trials take a long time, and most are recruiting a very select cluster of boys, and we'll come back to that later. PPMD was founded in 1994, focused solely on Duchenne muscular dystrophy. We take a very comprehensive approach, focusing on research, advocacy, care, and education. We have a registry with about 5,000 registrants in it. And we offer free genetic testing and free counseling for many patients with Duchenne. And as I said, the impact of all this and what we've done, we have over 40 companies in the space and many programs testing various strategic therapeutic approaches. And so that's very encouraging for us. So this is just a picture of our drug development pipeline in 2019, and it's broken out. As you can see, the green bars, we like to think of the disease or the therapies that are being developed. The green side of it is restoring or replacing dystrophin. Dystrophin is the protein that is missing, that is needed for proper muscle health. And then the therapies that are on the right in the non-green, all the other colors, those are different strategic approaches that are being taken to deal with all the downstream effects of not having dystrophin and the death of some of the muscle cells. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Ryan, who's going to take you through some of the first part of the patient voice.
Great, thanks, Abby. So, like many other organizations, PPMD was started by affected families. I just want to get this slide up. We were founded by a mom by the name of Pat Furlong. So we really did start with the patient voice as an organization. And over time, medicine really has, it's moved from a paternalistic approach to care and drug development to a much more patient-centered approach. and it's really been thanks to patient advocacy, works of incredible congressional champions, that we were able to pass a bill called the Food and Drug Safety and Innovation Act, which was passed under PDUFA 5, and really serves as a watershed moment for the patient voice in drug development. PPMD, along with many other foundations and organizations like MDA, works successfully together to advocate for specific provisions that you see on your screen within that final bill. And it included in that legislation, Congress essentially mandated the FDA take the views of patients and better integrate them into regulatory processes, and especially those performing those benefit risk assessments at the FDA, that they take a much more structured and transparent approach to incorporating that patient voice into the process. So this was a big watershed moment, as I mentioned, and something we immediately tried to take advantage of. So when FDASIA passed PPMD, we really spared no time in beginning to look at sort of innovative ways of engaging the FDA and drug companies about our community to inform the work they were doing on behalf of patients. Over time, we've invested really in developing a series of tools for anyone in the drug development ecosystem, so that they were more aware of how patients and caregivers think and feel on a range of topics. We developed white papers. We have done qualitative data, quantitative data. We have a patient registry that's expanded. We've engaged with the FDA over time, as well as with experts in our space so they better understand the disease. And we've held open public meetings. And then finally, we've conducted a series of what are called patient preference studies, collecting data on how patient and caregivers view benefit, risk, uncertainty, and aspects of emerging therapies. So I think everyone knows that, patient data takes a number of different forms, and gathering data on our communities can take these different forms. So there's qualitative data, which does a great job of describing things. You all have participated or facilitated these focus groups, open-ended surveys, testimonies, interviews, et cetera. And then there's the more quantitative pieces like patient registries, patient-recorded outcomes, quality of life, et cetera, polling data, and things like that. But there's a good way to do both, and we found that through the use of patient preference studies, gathering meaningful information about your patient population. And we've done studies on caregiver preferences, symptom priorities, pulmonary outcomes, gene therapies. We're in the middle of a global study right now in 8 countries to see if there's differences within those countries. We've had support from several companies, and this has been in the pre-competitive space. So they're not dictating exactly what the research questions are, but they're on the community advisory board. And then we have 2 academic collaborators we've worked with over time. So just to review, stated preference methods, these are special surveys, and it's how we can analyze data around what people think and feel. It's really quantifying the patient voice. And there are numbers that essentially explain things like how much bad will people accept for the good, or how much risk are people willing to tolerate giving a particular benefit, and then things like how do people prioritize different factors when making a decision on, say, whether to participate in a clinical trial. So these studies are very useful in gathering information on a large swath of your community and then better communicating to those in our drug development ecosystem about the thoughts and feelings of that community. So just to look at just some of the examples, we've done a number of studies. I just wanted to point out a few of them and show you what they actually look like. So here you have caregiver preferences for emerging therapies, the first one we did. And the FDA, when we first engaged them, were saying, we understand that you're telling us that your caregivers are willing to take on more risk for their children when it comes to therapies, but we don't have any data to back that up. And we said, well, we will go and get data, and that's what we did. This first study, you see an example of one of the things the survey participants had to take this best-worst scaling of a hypothetical treatment profile, and they had to tell us what was best in the treatment profile and what was worst, and then whether or not they would actually take the treatment. We do a series of these hypothetical treatment profiles, and then we can quantify how they weigh different attributes of these treatments. And what we found in that first study was by far caregivers were willing to take on considerable risks in order to stop or slow the progression of the disease, and they actually even traded off on longer lifespans. So they were looking for quality of life over quantity in this study, and they prioritized that protection of muscle function over everything else. Another study we did was on symptom prioritization that involved both caregivers and patients for the first time. We surveyed patients. And in this first exercise, they needed to tell us, among non-skeletal muscle treatment targets, which ones did they prioritize? And we found, and it was no surprise to us, but it helped confirm that they prioritized treatments targeting the heart and the lungs. So this gave good information to both the FDA and drug developers about potential outcomes and treatment profiles that would be acceptable for patients. And then the follow-on experiment in that study looked at meaningful pulmonary benefit. I think we can all agree that some of these outcome assessment tools for outcomes like pulmonary, FVC score, MIP and MEP, things that don't really tell us what's meaningful to patients. So what we found in this experiment was that having a stronger cough and less lung infections, these represented meaningful benefits. We had a similar best-worst case experiment that they took, and they traded off on what was best and worst within the treatment profile and whether or not they would take that treatment. So those are just some examples of what you could do with preference studies. Another important aspect of patient engagement, of course, is convening your communities. I think that's one of the strengths of patient advocacy groups, is we can convene all the experts. So we decided to put on our own patient-focused Compass meeting because we had been watching the FDA's PFDD externally led meetings, their Voice of the Patient meetings, with a lot of intrigue, but we felt as a community we were at a different place with our engagement with the FDA, with our understanding of the disease, and with our relationships with other federal agencies. So we decided to do a different type of meeting, but modeled it off the PFDD sort of format. We talked to the FDA, we talked to Magana and Teresa Mullins from the office that oversees this work, and we put together a meeting that concentrated on specific identifying current policy, care, and trial priorities by subpopulation, renew our existing relationships, and then look at gaps. What are we missing? And this meeting was done 2 years back. The audience included families, industry, clinicians, federal partners, as well as patient advocacy groups, and MDA was one of those groups who were in attendance. The structure, we followed the similar elements of PFDD. We had panels of patients across the journey. We did Q&A. We did live polling. You see an example of that live polling. They were able to answer questions straight from their phone. Again, some of these elements are already in the externally led PFD meetings with FDA, and we recorded and live streamed and posted that online, as well as put together a report which summarized the meeting and showed the results of the polling. We felt that this expanded on the PFDD workshop framework and created a new model for other patient groups who want to put their own meeting together, not necessarily wait in queue for the FDA to say, okay, it's 6 months and we can do this meeting. We felt we could lead the meeting ourselves and invite all those industry and federal agency partners. And again, it went beyond the FDA. We invited NIH and CDC and those agencies we touch. Finally, we produced a report which came out with some recommendations, including looking at the caregiver family spillover and health economic models, as well as some priorities for data collection, which included PRO development, which there's a deficit of good PRO instruments within our disease state. And speaking of that, we are proud to sign on to a grant with Chad Heathwell at the University of Rochester. MDA, in parallel, is funding a specific grant for a PRO with adults. PPMD and Duchenne UK are also funding a PRO for the children with disease. So this work is going to be done in parallel, but we're working together to make sure that we're communicating what we're doing and really going on the same path together to get a proper validated PRO that could be used in trials. And again, this engages the patient community, the patient voice. While these instruments are being developed, they're not done in isolation. They're done by talking directly with patients and caregivers. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Abby, who's going to talk about innovative trial designs and platform studies and how the voice of the patient can impact those.
Thank you, Ryan. So just moving on, I think Ryan went over ways of collecting some of the data, hearing describing and quantifying the voice of the patient, what symptoms matter to them. So what I'm going to talk about is really listening to our community and then trying to, innovate in the actual design of the trials to meet the patient community's needs. And if you look back in history, there's been innovations in trial design that have definitely come from the patient voice. They're very patient-centric. The I-SPY and I-SPY 2, that was one of the first platform trials. And I'm using that term platform trial, and I'll describe what it is later on. But that is a very patient-centric trial design that are very innovative, and they're getting a lot of attention. These days are very collaborative, so they involve not only the patients but all the stakeholders in the drug development ecosystem. So that's probably one of the bigger ones. We have two Alzheimer's trials consortiums that are trying these innovative trial designs. And then most recently in the bottom right, the Healy Center, there's an ALS, and that's again an MDA disease. An ALS platform trial just recently got the green light from the FDA to go ahead, and there will be 3 drugs being tested simultaneously at once, and I'll be going over that. So, we're really trying, I think that leaders in drug development are really trying to listen to the voice of the patient and try to speed along the trial system so that we can get to the answers faster, and that's what these master protocols or platform trials are all about. So going back to one of my earlier slides when I was talking about the drug development landscape and all those companies being in the space, and we have over 40 therapies being developed, that is a really good thing. There's a lot of drug development, a lot of investment going in. I think after ALS, there was a study done by IQVIA, and we were the second most well-resourced drug development disease. But it also comes with its downsides, and that means that all those trials and all those companies are competing for patients to fill their trials. And in fact, we did an analysis looking at the inclusion criteria for the trials that are going on in the Duchenne space, and 75% of the patients that are needed to fill those trials come from this sweet spot between about ages 5 and 12. And that is, typically Duchenne patients start losing ambulation. They start declining a little bit around age 12. And so many of the trials are designed to, the outcome measures are for ambulatory boys. So that makes kind of a bottleneck for us. Some of the trials can take 4 years to enroll. If you're a patient, you screen, you get in the trial, then you have to wait till the trial is fully enrolled, then you have to go through the trial, then you have to wait for the results at the end. I mean, this is a very long time to be waiting for the answers. And at the same time, I think you also saw that drug development pipeline slide showed just how many choices are out there. So, the families have a lot of choice as to which therapy to pursue. Obviously, there's things like distance and route of administration that might be a preference for them. But in general, there's a lot of choices out there. And although that seems like a great thing, it also can be quite confusing for parents that are very busy working, taking care of their children with disabilities. So if there was some way that we could ease that decision for parents and help them make these choices and study all these, don't make it so they have to choose just one, but we're trying to move all of them together faster. That would be a good thing. So as Ryan talked about, PPMD is doing a lot of surveys and preference work and trying to just collect in various ways what our patient community, what matters to them. So we do a lot of polling at our conference. This data happened to come from our annual conference 2 years ago, but we've corroborated this data in many other forms. I think at this Compass meeting, some of the same questions were asked. And when we talk with patients about trials and what is most important to them in terms of joining a new trial, it consistently comes out that the possibility of getting a placebo is something that deters them from getting into a trial, from wanting to participate. Like just the thought of being put on a placebo is really a deterrent. And the second thing is they worry about their child being eligible for future trials, and that speaks to the eligibility criteria and the inclusion criteria and that sweet spot of boys. Like if you're a child and you come into a trial at age 7 and it takes 5 years to go through the whole trial process, you might not fit the inclusion criteria because you're now non-ambulatory for the next, your next shot on goal. So that's really concerning to our community as well. So as we began to, understand what really mattered to our community, and we also looked around at what was happening in other spaces, and we realized that a solution might be these master protocols. And in fact, this slide is a review article. It's the cover of a review article that was written by Dr. Woodcock of the FDA and Dr. Lissa Lavange, who was at the FDA, and she's very involved and is still involved in the cystic fibrosis world. And this idea of these master protocols that can study multiple therapies and multiple diseases or both at the same time was really intriguing for us. And the two hallmarks of these types of trials is that it uses a trial network with infrastructure, and there's also a common protocol that incorporates innovative statistics, and it also allows for a lot of standardization because all the investigators, there's one common protocol that's being followed. So these platform trials, so a subtype of master protocol is a platform trial. That's what the ALS trial, the design is, the I-SPY trial design. Many of them are platform trials where you're studying multiple therapies in basically the same patient population at once. So I wanted to try to give you what the patient journey would look like in one of these trials. So you start out and you're given the information. Maybe there's 3 therapies that are recruiting, that are open to enroll. So you decide that, well, I'd be okay with getting randomized to any one of those therapies. So you are randomized and you get placed into one of these arms. And the next thing that happens, you actually go through a second randomization step within that arm, and you're going to get randomized to either the active part of it, or you're going to be put on the placebo for that particular arm. So you can see that there's active for each therapy and there's a placebo for each therapy. But at the bottom, I showed that pool. So all those placebos from all those different therapies can actually be pooled together. And this gives important statistical power. And I'll show you in a minute, it's actually very meaningful for patients what this pooled placebo allows us to do. So all this data is collected, and the sponsors of all the different therapies, they're collecting, the active, the treatment arm is being collected. The placebo arm is being collected, but that information is actually aggregated, and it can be used by all, and it actually provides for a lot of learnings that really can be a source of so much information. And there also, another hallmark of these platform trials is that when there's enough patients built up in there, there's regular interim analyses. So based on these learnings, I just said that we're collecting this data, we're looking at the aggregate data, the placebo data, and we're also doing these regular interim analyses. There are adaptations. This is where the innovative statistics come into place. So you can adapt the protocol midstream, and that is very unlike a typical trial that is done today based on some of those learnings. So an adaptation could be you could stop for success or futility, you could change dose, you could change the duration of a particular arm, sample size, randomization weights. There's many different things, but all those learnings can be incorporated into the trial design as it's ongoing, which is really very, very unique and very powerful. So now the other thing that can happen is, these trials are ongoing. They're meant to be perpetual. And another therapy could come in and you could add an arm. They would go through that same randomization process. That placebo would join the other placebos, and that actually makes a statistical power of the trial even higher, and also allows for less patients to be enrolled. And I'll show you that because you're sharing each analysis, each primary analysis for a particular arm is borrowing placebo patients from the other arms. So if you, just to give you a little bit of idea of the power of these trials and doing a little bit of math, if we took the next 12 therapies solo, and you know the rule of thumb is that 1 in 12 therapies is going to be successful, and you powered each of those solo trials at 80%, and you randomized 75 versus 75, so it's 1-to-1, it would take 1,800 patients, and half of those would be on placebo. If you enrolled them, if we had the platform trial up and running with at least 3 arms enrolling at any one time, all you need is 3. And again, the same power as if you were doing those 12 therapies one at a time. The randomization can now be 75 to 25 because you have that borrowing power of the placebo patients from the other arms. It would take 1,200 patients, and of those 1,200, only 300 would have to be on placebo. So I think you can see that we are meeting the needs of the patient community, those needs that we gathered, that this whole idea of being placed on the placebo, it's just really hard for our community. And until we get to external controls being validated, there has to be some sort of placebo, but this is a way to meet that need. So the outcome of this is that you reduce the overall patients needed for these 12 therapies by 1/3. You reduce the number on placebo by 2/3, and you're enrolling more quickly. So the time to get to any one answer is reduced by 50%. So it's really a powerful trial design and very patient-centric. I talked a little bit about when I showed you that article that Dr. Woodcock and Lavange wrote there, the operational efficiencies, that trial network, that infrastructure really makes things happen quickly. You probably all know that some of the biggest time in getting a trial up and running is getting the contracting done, going through the IRB process. Well, in these types of trials, you have a lot of things that are set up beforehand. So when an arm comes in or a new therapy comes in, it can start enrolling very quickly. And the scientific efficiency, so not only are you just moving things along more quickly, you're also learning a lot more because of that. A lot of it stems from that shared placebo. We hear a lot about data sharing right now and how things are siloed, and that's because the way the trial ecosystem is designed right now, things are very one by one. But if we have the shared placebo and it's all being collected in a standardized manner, we can very quickly aggregate that data. And then that data can be analyzed, learnings can be used to discover new endpoints, biomarkers, and also all those learnings, as I said before, you can incorporate those back into the platform with the protocol methodology to start with, and things will just be even more efficient. So I think, the platform trial approach we're doing it because it's very, very patient-centric. Like, we listen to our patient community. We're trying to meet their needs. But I think also when we got into it and we started educating ourselves about it and looking at some of the other successful models, we really realized that there's value for every player in the clinical trial ecosystem. So you have benefits for the patients, you have benefits for the investigators, you have benefits for the regulators and the sponsors. So it's really it's a heavy lift. It's a lot of coordination and upfront collaboration and investment. It's a little bit of a paradigm shift. I think everyone has to agree that it's okay to do things a little bit differently because the benefits in the long term will be worth it. But it's really worth it all for all. So in closing, I think what Ryan and I have tried to show you is that there's many different ways that PPMD is working to listen to the patient voice, to collect and analyze the patient voice, and and to inject that patient voice into all aspects of the drug development pipeline. I think typically we think of the patient voice, back in the HIV days, as just chaining themselves to the chain link fence at the FDA. It comes in the regulatory step of the whole process. And I think that we're trying to shift everything to the left and much earlier, and try to engage with the patient community much earlier in the process, so that we have more patient-centric trial design, phase 2 and 3 recruitment efforts, all the way through regulatory and post-market. So Ryan, would you like to add anything?
Abby, we only have a few minutes because the webinars are normally 30 minutes, but we're going to just take a few minutes to answer a few questions that came through. And one in particular is about the platform study. A question around where is this in process, because obviously it takes a lot to set up, and we're right now in a specific stage of seeing if this is possible and putting together the pieces. Could you just clarify on that?
Yeah, I talked a little bit about the upfront planning. We're still in that planning and evaluation place. So, we're working on getting a protocol and trying to see if we can, get enough key opinion leaders and investigators to agree on a protocol. And then there's the whole other side of planning for a platform trial, which is the infrastructure side. So it's all still a work in progress. It is a very, very, very big lift. We think it would be beneficial if we could make it happen, but there's many steps on this staircase to get to success to make it a reality. Did that answer your question, Ryan?
And I think a lot of this is about, can we at least get to a yes or a no quicker on some of these drugs, so that patients aren't locked into trials, in some cases 10 years we've seen them on expanded access, et cetera. The other follow-up question to this was, would this most likely, this first generation of this, apply to those foundational therapies that are trying to treat the underlying cause, like dystrophin replacement, or do we see this as something that's more appropriate for downstream, if you can address that as well?
So at this point, because of the complexities of the trial and the endpoint, standardized endpoints, outcome measures, what we're collecting, and also the shared placebo, anything that is mutation specific at this point, we're probably not going to accept those at the first go round, because we have to understand, we have to do some analysis. We have to look at that data within that pooled placebo arm to see what kind of a difference does different mutations have. We have the Duchenne community, we have some knowledge of the effect of different mutations on rate of progression, but we need to validate that. So without knowing that and how that might skew a placebo arm, we're not taking those mutation-specific therapies up front. But all others are fair game.
Yeah, and I think there's also questions around those follow-on therapies and their impact, but you could see it layering onto somebody who might be on one of those foundational initial therapies that may be approved, and doing a combination approach to see which combinations could work. The other question that came through is, are there other disease states that have used this innovation?
So yes, I think I showed you that slide where it really started in oncology. A lot of these trial innovations have started in the cancer space. The I-SPY2, the breast cancer trial, there's LungMap, and I think we're trying to now take what they have, and in cancer, there's just many rewards that have been reaped from this trial design. So now we're trying to take what they learned and how they did it in oncology and apply it to the rare disease world. So I think the ALS example, that's the most recent trial that started. Pancreatic cancer is recently starting. I'm part of a couple of different groups. There's a CITI, the Clinical Trial Transformation Initiative, and they have a working group of multiple stakeholders who are working on these master protocols. And because they're so new, we're trying to sort of put together a roadmap for other diseases to use.
Yeah, that's a great point. The other question that came in, and I think this is a good question, what is the perception of companies at this point? Are they hesitant to do platform trials, and do you think the attitude is changing at all?
I think, yes, there's a lot of hesitation. I mean, for companies especially, like I said, I mentioned it, every stakeholder has to agree to do things a little bit differently. But for companies who answer to a lot of, financial bosses and timeline bosses and milestone bosses, it is giving up a little bit of control. So that's probably the biggest hesitation. But I think as these expand into other diseases like the ALS platform trial starting, I do think that the attitude is changing, and that I think in 10 years we will be doing clinical trials in a different way.
I think FDA has voiced that agreement as well. I like the analogy of, at the moment, we're building a house and taking it down and building a house and taking it down, and it's this one-by-one approach. And for life-limiting diseases where many patients only have one shot at a clinical trial, we just feel like something's got to give, and we need to at least think differently through, is there a possible way? And I think it's important to note that the current trials underway right now, this would not completely take over the fact that some trials are still going to be one by one. But it's a different way of looking at things.
Yeah, and the other thing to think about is, this one-by-one approach, and that building the house and tearing it down, like every company is doing GCP training at the sites. Every company is doing, they're all doing these very similar processes at every site, and it's redundant. And in fact, it ends up, it's almost like companies are competing on who has the best outcome measures or who does the best training, instead of companies should be competing on, is my drug the best, right? And so moving to a platform trial approach kind of moves towards that paradigm.
Yeah, and I think that we all would agree that time is our enemy in many ways, and if we can look at potentially trying something new and different, it's worth exploring, and I think that's been our message. So I think we're a bit over time. There's been some questions that have come through that I'm sure Amicus MDA and PPMD will take a look at and make sure that there is responses to, but I just want to thank both MDA and Amicus once again for the opportunity to present today. And Abby, I'll let you close out.
No, I echo what Ryan just said. This is just thank you very much, and we hope this was helpful. And I'm sure through MDA you can reach us if you have any further questions. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone.